So I wanted to thank Professor Thompson, because his viewpoints are, how do you deal with the climate crisis in real time, in real communities, in terms of real people? We have with us Vicki Arroyo, who is the executive director of the Georgetown Climate Center at Georgetown Law Center. Now, many of you probably know Vicki. If you don't, she's both a scholar and advocate. And it's a pleasure to have her, and I want to thank her for taking time out of her busy schedule to talk about just that. We have a climate clock. It's ticking, as Senator Whitehouse stated. That's why there was the rally with 42 Democrats. And we have to take a look at what is the big picture. Because folks that are climate non-believers, I don't really think they get the big picture. And so, Vicki, thank you so much for joining us and giving us some context on this.
Thank you so much. And I have to admit, when I got the call about speaking to this collaborative, I had never heard of the Emerald Cities Collaborative, but of course I've heard of Emerald City. And in fact, my stage debut in New Orleans, where I grew up, and I had a family who did community theater, was as a munchkin. And so I dug back, and I went through an old scrapbook that was saved, even though my family was affected by Katrina. Instead of showing some of those family photos, I found this lovely gleaming pictures of Emerald City, because I actually thought it was sort of like a nice iconic image for this discussion, because here you see the dense, compact urban development, very green, and then you see the wildlife and the green space all around it and the people coexisting with that gleaming city. And also, I just like the most famous phrase from Wizard of Oz, which is there's no place like home, which I think really is one way that I like to try to message around why it's important and how you can engage people who might not usually want to talk about climate change, because the impacts that we're already seeing affect our homes. And I think if you really have this conversation in a way that's place-based, we might be able to make some progress. I want to start with a couple of slides that are more, just 101 on climate, and I know many of you know this, but the climate disasters are increasing, fueled by the energy in the system, if you will. And so you can see how this trend differs from meteorological storm events or hydrological events like floods versus things that would not be caused by climate change, which is that red line that's relatively flat, things like earthquakes and tsunamis that are geophysical events. And so this is a global phenomenon. It's not just here in the United States that we're seeing these kind of billion-dollar weather disasters. And of course, we know that the rate of sea level rise is accelerating. And of course, most of our population are in urban areas and often mostly around the coast of not just this country, but the world. Last year, the Government Accountability Office, for the first time, added climate change to the top list of threats for the United States. And that's in part because the U.S. government actually owns quite a bit of land. We all do, as people, citizens. But also, if you think about it, the federal government provides crop insurance, provides flood insurance, and also bails people out in times of disaster. And so they're really already starting to see the cost of this add up. And if you wait a while, you'll see even higher cost over time. And so while I would like to tell you a reassuring lie and take us all to a happy Oz-like place this afternoon, I'm not quite able to do that. But what I am going to try to do is to give you some examples of the work that we do and some of the observations that we're making about the jurisdictions that often deal with climate change in the context of disasters and rebuilding and maybe trying to rebuild differently with climate change in mind, and some of the policy obstacles, because of course we're in Washington, so I have to talk to you about policy and law, and what the administration's doing to try to change that, including with the help of our Climate Center and some of the funders in this room actually who make our work and others here possible. So that gleaming city in the distance isn't Oz. That's actually my hometown of New Orleans. That's the skyline of New Orleans. And of course, 80% of the city was inundated by Hurricane Katrina. And just a few short weeks later, Hurricane Rita hit the state and Texas. So that 1-2 punch cost roughly $100 billion, not to mention all the things that you can't quantify, including 1,836 people died in that tragic event. And in my own family, we actually suffered losses too. The top picture is my mom's single-story house, and the water was up to the roof, so people died in her Gentilly neighborhood. That's not her car. It was actually carried there by floodwaters that were up to the roof. That's the inside and the outside. And then my sister and her husband lived near the 17th Street Canal Breach, and that's what her kitchen looked like. She never used her her kitchen, but, in any case, she still didn't want it to look like that. And so they lost their homes and just about everything in them. But fortunately, they did get out in time, and like many people, really took the belongings that they thought would get them through a evacuation for a couple of days to Pensacola. And I was actually the one. I mean, when you talk to Denise about, phoning home, there was no home to phone to. The phones didn't work for forever there. But I was the one, because I wasn't in the hurricane zone, who had to tell them that this was what happened. I mean, the water was, above their roofs for a very long time. They couldn't go home. And so it offered for them to come live with me, which they did, along with friends and lots of pets. This is the before and after picture of my sister Beth and her husband Terry's house. And they and my mom and my mom's friend and others came for quite a bit of time. But since there's no place like home, and they felt out of place, they felt like they were in the witness protection program, my sister said, being plucked out of their life and put into mine, they moved back to New Orleans. But it was really uncertain for a long time who was going to move back and where they were going to move back. So this is obviously a picture of a school. And if you recall, it was the very beginning of the school year when Katrina hit. And yet the federal funding formulas under FEMA often basically pay you, depending on how much damage, to put back into place what you had before, the same way, the same place, right? Which didn't really make a heck of a lot of sense when 80% of your city was underwater, people dispersed at the beginning of the year, kids were put into school systems, whether it be Atlanta or Houston or Pensacola or Washington or wherever they ended up. And so the city had been asking from the previous administration of both the city and also the president under Bush, can we have that, formula added up, and can you please give us the money in one lump sum so that we can put schools back where people are coming back and in a way that makes sense and hopefully more resiliently. But as you can see from seeing Arnie Duncan, and you probably can't see, but it's August 2010, so 5 years at full after Katrina, they finally got the ability to take that and to use the money for construction and renovation projects accordingly. And the small little neighborhood elementary school that was my school, Hines Elementary, just opened a couple of years ago after all these years in this bigger and more concentrated form. But that's how long it took to sort of work through these issues. They're also building infrastructure differently. I mean, of course, the levees breaking is famous, and people know about the levees and the pumps in New Orleans, where 50% of the city lies below sea level. Here's an example of what we can do with bridges, where the bridges are being put back in place 21 feet higher to allow for a greater storm surge in an era of climate change. And of course, these kinds of impacts are not just happening to the Gulf Coast, they're happening on this coast as well. And people, I think, really became aware of what it meant when you looked at what happened to New York, which I think people felt was pretty sophisticated in its sustainability and its resilience planning, but you see the outages and everything like that. And you also see how the dollars are really adding up from these mega storms. One jurisdiction that we work with at the Climate Center is Vermont, an inland state, so people don't really think of it as prone to hurricanes, but Tropical Storm Irene cut off towns in Vermont and New York. It was very serious. These people really had no access to food and water and civilization, and their roads and bridges were taken out by the water, just basically scouring out those bridges or blowing out the culverts like you see on the left. 900 of those culverts were blown out that local communities had to replace with their own tax dollars, very small towns, and these bridges, about 300 of them. And so they replaced them with these better open box culverts that allow for better fish passage, so it's better for wildlife, and it's also better in terms of resilience. But guess what? They were denied reimbursement by FEMA because they didn't put it back the same way, which makes no sense, because we know that with climate change, we're going to see more precipitation and more of these very, massive storms. So they're having that discussion right now, one by one, trying to, go back and get them approved. But this is an attempt to really build differently with climate change in mind. Some of these lessons were learned by the time Sandy came along and devastated New York. You'll recall that even New York, as sophisticated as it is, had some real issues with subway flooding. In fact, half of the nation's transit trips were not available the morning after Sandy, because so much of it happens in that region, New York and New Jersey. And I know that you'll be hearing from someone, Robert, this afternoon on the Hurricane Sandy rebuilding strategy, and we've done some analysis that you can look at on our site about the Appropriations Act that started to allow for some of this flexibility that I mentioned that had been negotiated in Katrina or after Katrina. So some of those lessons have been learned, and with each storm we learn more and better. And there are some tools that people are using, like this portable cover of some of the entrances to the transit. You also see, under Mayor Bloomberg, plans for land use change put out there with climate change in mind, and even buildings. And I know many of you work on buildings and realize that simple steps like having operable windows make sense, because a lot of times the casualties come not necessarily from the flood immediately, but from the fact that people are stuck in these hot houses or high rises in the case of New York, where you can't hope to evacuate everyone. But so just being able to open your window or elevating your emergency equipment, which not only wasn't the case in many buildings like commercial or residential, but hospitals in both Sandy and in Katrina were affected because their equipment was on the ground floor. Sloped sidewalks and tree pits to capture the water. Not to mention the fact that for many years, New York has been a leader in trying to build more sustainably in terms of efficiency and renewables. I just came from Boston, where Spaulding Hospital, which took in a lot of people, it's a rehabilitation hospital, it took in a lot of people after the Boston Marathon bombing, had been built with some of these impacts or potential impacts in mind. They built it higher, so there are ramps, and the floors that the patients are on are elevated. You see that they've elevated their mechanical and electrical systems. They do have operable windows. I mean, that's just terrific in a hospital, both for quality of life, I think, and for the patient's health and well-being, as well as for a situation where your grid comes down. And actually, this is a picture of smart grid, and I know there's a lot going on there, but the basic idea is that smart grid, as you know, whether or not you work on efficiency or renewables on the clean energy side or on the resilience side, has actually multiple benefits, which this is trying to capture, because you not only can deal with demand of things like electric vehicles, which we just heard about, and try to actually use that power sometimes from electric vehicles or wind farms or solar and have that distributed generation feed into the system, but you can also allow your system to reroute when there is an outage because of trees down or lines down from ice storms or storms. And you can really get that energy to the places that need it most. So some of those critical care facilities or nursing homes or hospitals. And in fact, again, another benefit from not just working on clean vehicles and fuels from a clean air perspective or a mitigating climate change perspective is that some of these vehicles were actually really instrumental in getting people out before storms. Some were used CNG, so compressed natural gas, or electric vehicle trucks were used to get people out in advance, and also for debris removal after the storm when there were those long lines that went on for weeks. And people in EVs, there was a New York Times story about that, how the EV people who had charged up before the storm were sort of zipping by those gas lines. So some of these solutions can provide for win-wins. Other places are already looking at building with sea level rise and climate change in mind. The Deer Island Water Treatment Plant in Boston did that all the way back in the 80s. They had made plans to build it higher, and then in addition now they're using their methane again, and I think that's a great example of one of these kind of win-wins. In San Francisco, Treasure Island is being built with dedicated open space, with setbacks, with some elevated, sort of densely populated structures, and with the financing and flood protection really sort of built into the system so that if there is a problem, they'll be well suited to do it. Because as you heard earlier, I don't think any of us want a barren coast where everything is just seawalls all around. That certainly wouldn't be great for quality of life, and it certainly wouldn't be great for our economies or our fisheries or ecosystems as well, because that's, of course, where a lot of things hatch, is in wetlands and ecosystems. So we work with states like Maryland and with Alabama that are promoting living shoreline solutions and having those wetlands be able to migrate in, or dune systems, which also can serve as a buffer in a sense of climate change. In fact, even before Sandy, there was a competition for designers to envision what the future might look like, and this Rising Currents exhibit was at MoMA for a time. But again, you have the policies that really were built with other things in mind. And so you have a permitting process that the Army Corps has that really catalyzes people to do these kind of hard armored seawalls, because you can get that permit within days, whereas getting an individual permit that looks at your unique ecological situation takes longer and puts some more onus on the individual or the state to do it. Some of these states are taking control of the process so they can bypass this. But it's just another example of some of the policy barriers. Summer heat is going to get worse. That's the most direct impact of climate change. And as you can see, it does matter whether or not you're dealing with a low emission scenario, or we can start to try to get this problem under control with policies like you saw the Obama administration thankfully putting out recently to deal with our own air pollution from power plants. But, we might get to the point in the middle of the century, not to mention the 2080s, which is that lower right-hand corner with the high emission scenario, where we'd be happy to have a day like the day last summer when President Obama spoke at Georgetown's campus, and we were all just so hot, and he was like wiping his brow, and he's a cool customer, so for him to get hot in that way, we were like, wow, it's a really hot day. And that will be a day that unfortunately I think our children will actually wish they had at the rate that we're going, as you can see from these projections. We've already had heat waves that have led to deaths in Chicago in 1995, 700 deaths roughly from that heat wave. And here, this is a picture of the city's green roof, and here it's an infrared picture where the one that's sort of darker is this roof in the infrared picture, and the neighboring asphalt roof of Cook County, which actually they've changed subsequently, so I probably should stop showing it. But the point is that it's a 77-degree temperature differential at the surface. So there are things that we can do to the urban environment. Dallas has a green building code addressing heat islands through cool roof requirements citywide. We worked, our staff and students, on DC's sustainability plan to include considerations of adaptation or resilience as part of that plan. And now subsequently are working with University of Michigan's public health school, where we're looking at how much impervious surface there is around the town to figure out where you can target outreach, either for changing your buildings to have cooler roofs or green roofs, or to target outreach so that some of those citizens who are shut-ins, who might be more vulnerable because they're old or have chronic illness, can be targeted as people that we can reach out to and make sure that they get to cooling centers. Philadelphia has done this neat thing where they had a contest to see which block could be the coolest block, and they gave them weatherization assistance funds, painted the roofs white. They're having NASA measure how much this is affecting and reducing the urban heat island impact, and they're actually measuring the savings that these people in the houses have. You heard about the strains on water. And obviously out west, they're already in a severe drought, and that has dramatic consequences that we're seeing. We've been working with jurisdictions in Texas, where Austin, of course, is very vulnerable. You see them reaching near all-time lows in some of their lakes. And you see some communities in Texas doing water recycling, not just for gray water, like you see in Tucson, where its water ordinance requires new construction to have outlets so that you can have access to water that came from tubs or from the dishwasher. But actually in Texas, where they're actually taking wastewater from the toilet to tap, as they say, which when you think about quality of life of that, but this is really where we are in an era of climate change, and we get questions about the legality of that and the Clean Water Act and such. In my own hometown, they had a lot of smart people who, after Katrina, when people were still evacuated to wherever they were, Baton Rouge or Arlington with me, a group of folks, including the Urban Land Institute and the mayor at the time, put out this green dot plan that said, we're going to keep these parts of the city green and not have people come back. But again, there's no place like home. You can imagine how people who were already upset from having lost their homes felt about that. And so that didn't really politically take off very well, as you can imagine. But what ended up happening is the mayor said, okay, well, let's see what neighborhoods can bring themselves back. And so neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, people started to come back and really, energized with their own interest in rebuilding their city more sustainably, including Beacons of Hope in Lakeview, where Denise Thornton started out, helping her neighbors, helping people in Gentilly, where my mom lived and where this gentleman lived, and then later on helping victims of Hurricane Isaac, which came a little bit later in LaPlace. And since then, some of these vacant lots are actually being used to contour and find ways to be rain gardens effectively, to sort of hold water in the more frequent storms than we have. Not when the levees break, hopefully that won't happen again. But I think what's interesting, you're seeing sort of like a reverse bottom-up green dot plan where they're using some of this green space very effectively to catch the water. And in fact, just a few months ago when it was still pretty chilly, you can see Gina McCarthy, the administrator of EPA, and Mitch Landrieu, the mayor of New Orleans. This was just 2 blocks away on the street that my mom lived before in the Gentilly neighborhood of New Orleans, looking at some of the rain gardens that they're trying to put out. So in closing, the work of the Climate Center includes toolkits to deal with sea level rise or urban heat island impact, case studies that could be useful to people. And in addition to profiling what communities that we work with are doing, we have this resource which has over 1,000 examples of what's happening on these features, and it can find resources near you. Check it out, adaptationclearinghouse.org or .com, you can find us. And I mentioned that President Obama spoke at Georgetown last summer, which many of you know was a really hot day. He did talk about resilience as well as those power plant standards at the time, and we have been helping to work with his CEQ on having a series of workshops, not just the ones formally through the administration, but a parallel series of workshops with local, state, tribal governments, talking about some of these policy barriers that are really not helpful if we're really trying to promote resilience, and trying to make sure that he can do what he wants to do, which is to use all the existing authority that he has right now to move forward on climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, even if he has a Congress that doesn't want to be cooperative. We believe that there's a lot that you can do with existing authority, and we're trying to help make that case. I started with New Orleans, so I got to end on Detroit, which is another city that I love and where my husband is from, in the city of Detroit. And this is the Lafayette Gardens, which is, again, just a wonderful urban space that's doubling as a nice environmental feature now downtown in Detroit, a place that they're growing food, that food banks are using, a place where people can just rest and get out of the heat, and helps to sort of cool off the area in the summer. And so I just love that example of the win-win-wins. I was able to walk it when it was much colder and not quite as green and vibrant. And then this is finally another kind of Emerald City image of Detroit in 2025, according to Popular Mechanics, where they're envisioning this new Detroit, a re-energized Detroit that has, obviously, some of its power coming from green energy, water flowing, and the natural features, as well as the dense urban development in Detroit, which is a city that I think has a really bright future ahead. And so finally, I just want to say it's really up to all of us, no matter where we're from, to look at our homes and our communities and our vulnerabilities and our exposures to risks from climate change, and to find ways not just to survive, but to thrive. Thank you.